Thank you very much Miss, for that presentation. I think this is probably the first time I'm addressing you as Mr. Trott. First met our last speaker over about 10 years ago when the United States started to think strategically about maritime security in Africa. Then he was, even though he was much younger, he had much less hair. So it's very difficult to recognize him with his hair all grown out now that he's not in uniform anymore. But thank you so much for those insights. And those insights actually dovetail with a lot of what I have to say regarding air security. In November 2009, a Boeing 727 aircraft crashed just outside Gao in Mali. How many people remember that crash? It had an estimated 10 tons of cocaine aboard. That flight originated from Venezuela. We're not sure where it was going, who was involved, etc. But what that incident did was it highlighted the fragility of air domain awareness in Africa. How did that Boeing 727 make it all the way to Gao without being detected, without any paperwork, and with 10 tons of cocaine on board? Last month, the West African Commission on Drugs, which is an ad hoc commission headed by former Nigerian President Obasanjo, released a report on drugs in just West Africa. They estimated that the drugs that go through West Africa, mainly by plane, amount to 1.2 billion US dollar equivalent every year. 1.2 billion US dollar equivalent every year. That, by the way, incidentally, is about the same amount of foreign direct investment that came into West Africa in 2011 for the entire year. What does this tell us? It tells us that air security is not just something we think about at conferences like this, or in military barracks, or in ministries of defense or transportation. There is a big industry behind air insecurity in Africa. A lot of people are gaining significant amounts of money because of air insecurity in Africa. And tackling air insecurity in Africa is not going to be an easy task. My example of the crash of the 727 in Mali highlights just one aspect of air insecurity, that is air domain awareness. And the Africa Center has, since 2006, been paying a lot of attention to air insecurity. We've had a number of seminars, most recently April 2011, August 2012, and August last year, where we had regional and continent-wide meetings of air chiefs to sit and think strategically about these issues. So most of what I will be sharing is based on the wealth of experience of these people, of these senior officials, and people much smarter than I am. But there are two things that they highlighted about why air security is urgently needed. First, they said it's to improve surveillance. We need air domain awareness. We need to know what is flying over our countries and why. And this, they said, is important because the security threats facing Africa are both mobile and dispersed. And so air security brings that important capability. The second reason why they thought that air security is important is because rapid response is needed, both for transportation reasons and also for military engagement reasons, because of the urgency and complexity of the threats, because of the size of the continent, and because of inaccessibility in many of the areas where insecurity is greatest. And they said these are two overarching reasons why we need more air security in Africa. And so the question we posed to them after these really good positions is, why has there been so little attention paid to air security and air assets across the continent? Why is air security at times the poor relative in the military complex? And I came up with 4 reasons. The first is that in most African countries, our view of security is land-centric. We pay a lot of attention to land-centric, and this has a lot to do with what a number of speakers have been talking about this legacy of regime-based security. It was not about human security or security of the people, which would, by necessity, require security of not just land, but the sea and the air. But it was regime-based, so it was land-based. And because of these, and because of this land-centric approach to security in many African countries, both historically and in contemporary times, we see the air forces and air capabilities are under-resourced. The second reason why I think air security has not been has not received a lot of focus is because it's expensive. I think next to the Navy, air security is probably really, really expensive, and because of that, most countries have scarce resources. And they have a lot of other things to do with these scarce resources, and the competing demands on those resources means that generally air security doesn't get a lot of play. Third reason is because I think there has been, over the years, a lot of donor dependency, and I'll come to this issue later, which makes most of the assets available non-complementary, obsolete, and difficult to use, both within the countries and sub-regionally. And that's a big challenge. And the fourth reason why I think little attention has been paid is because we don't have mechanisms, regulations, and legislation that facilitates the sharing of information and coordination of effort. Again, both nationally and regionally. So, what specific role could air security play in today's security environment? We've talked about the security threats. We're still going over some of the threats, the human security, the territorial integrity issues. What specific role could this play? And for this particular brief section, I want to borrow from a March 2014 report by a UK-based think tank called Think Security Africa, and it's entitled Aviation Security in Africa. And there are 3 main roles that air security could play. First relates to national defense. Second, conflict management. And third, humanitarian relief. Let's talk a little bit about national defense. Air security is vital in Africa's national defense because it, first of all, affords the capability for what they call in military aviation jargon ISR, which is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Over the past couple of days, we've talked a lot about the diverse and varied threats that small, violent, non-state actors pose. When I was first discussing maritime security with the team from US Navy Europe, and we were saying, why is it so difficult to, know where these bad ships are, etc.? It's a huge space. If you think about it, there are individual countries on the African continent alone that are larger than the entire United States east of the Mississippi River. One country. How do you have assets to know what's going on where? Air security affords this, not just in terms of giving you collective ownership of the information that is being derived, but also providing all forces with a common operational picture. Second important way that air security strengthens national defense is through the ability to have patrols. And third is bolstering ground-to-air capabilities. And because we see increasingly, given the nature of the threat and the sophistication of some of these groups, there is a need for, there are needs for these capabilities. The second security, important security dimension is conflict management. We have talked a little bit this week. We'll be talking a lot more next Monday and Tuesday about regional approaches to security in Africa, and the whole concept of the standby force and regional response mechanisms. And one thing that is always lacking is heavy lift capacity. Being able to transport troops and supplies from wherever they are to where they're most needed in as efficient and effective a manner as possible. Very few African countries, if any, have the capacity to do this. And because of that, we are always dependent on what others can bring to the table to support us, and not what we can do for ourselves. Second, conflict management importance is close air support. And the third is enforcing embargoes. We know that in many cases, particularly for conflict management, you can't keep the peace if there is no peace to be kept. And in many cases, you really want to be able to enforce embargoes. You also want to be able to restrict the capability of the spoilers to prolong and protract violent conflicts. The third way, I think, and the report mentions that air security can bolster African security, is in the area of humanitarian relief. Disaster management is an area that we don't do very well with. It's very difficult to get assistance where it's most needed if you've had a man-made or natural disaster. And I think things like delivery of humanitarian supplies, transportation of personnel and equipment, sustaining humanitarian efforts, evacuation, and also direct operational support. So these are all areas that air security could be important, and all ways in which we can make the case for why air security should be given a lot more priority in Africa, particularly given the nature of the threat, the size of the continent, the need for effective and fast interventions, and also the fact that we have many areas being inaccessible because of terrain and also seasonal factors. So, Having laid all that out, what should be done to improve air security? There's a very, very, very long list. I'm going to very, very quickly go through 7 areas that I think should receive a bit more attention. The first, I think that African countries and African organizations should do a baseline survey to catalog all assets, policies, and expertise, both nationally and internationally. We talk a lot about sharing information, sharing assets, but you will not be surprised if I told you that we don't know who has what. And even if we know who has what, we don't know what is operational and what is not operational. And we don't know what interoperability looks like. How could we share? How could we even talk about sharing? So I think the first thing is that we do need a baseline survey of air assets, air security-related policies, and expertise. Secondly, I think we need practical mechanisms that promote and improve sharing. This requires political will, of course, but it also requires a plan, a strategy that would allow countries to work together. In the 1980s, there was a really interesting maritime security initiative called Operation Yukos that was funded by the European Union, and it involved the Senegalese Air Force patrolling West African waters as far down as Liberia. And this was only possible because that project provided a strategic framework that became a mechanism for countries to exchange information and to work together based on air assets. The third thing I think we should be thinking about to improve air security prospects is we need to more consciously integrate air security into both national security strategies and security sector reform/transformation efforts. A lot of these are still very land-centric. We really do need to have that integration. Fourth, I think we need to improve messaging to better explain and demonstrate the value of air components in national security. Most people see air security or investment in air security as a luxury, something the Air Force would like to do because it wants more toys. But understanding the national defense, disaster response, peace support operations, humanitarian dimensions, and showing the efficiencies that could be gained both nationally and regionally, I think we really need to work on the messaging. Fifth, I think that African countries need to think seriously about partnerships and not patronage. Particularly in the area of air security, there's a lot of patronage, i.e., Africa's friends telling African countries what they should buy, who they should train, and what sort of life cycle arrangements should be made. I can't tell you the number of African countries I've gone to where you have trained pilots who can't fly the planes their country has because they were trained elsewhere. Or you have air assets that you can't access spare parts or supplies. So if you have a true partnership and not patronage, you're in a better position. Sixth, I think that Africa should explore public-private partnerships, particularly in the area of air security. It's expensive. You can't have all the assets. There are certain things that the private sector does and does well. One is supply chain management with logistics in the aviation industry. There are ways that you could help. Secondly, there are existing assets that could be utilized. rather than purchasing. And I'm more than happy to talk a little bit more about this. Seventh, I think that we need to develop life cycle models for financing air assets both nationally and regionally. We tend to accept gifts when they're offered, but we have no understanding of the life cycle implications of those gifts. At the risk of being pilloried up here and being controversial, reminded of the brand new African Union building in Addis. It's leaking. And it's leaking badly. And who's going to fix it?
Chinese.
Yes. It's ours. The same with the air assets that we have. We have planes, we have helicopters, and we haven't factored life cycle financing mechanisms. Next Monday afternoon, we'll be talking about budgeting and procurement in the security sector. And we'll talk a little bit more about those financing. But it is one thing to say air security is important, we've got to do it. But it's a completely different thing to understand what that implies. Because the way you allocate and utilize your scarce resources reflects and demonstrates where your priorities lie. So if security is really an integrated thing that involves a land component, it involves maritime, it involves air, then the way we strategize from a resource perspective has to reflect that. Because I believe that just as the paradigm has shifted from traditional regime-based security to human security, from a strategic level as well, we should be shifting from this land-centric to a more relevant, agile, and representative type of security capability across the continent. And I think air security plays a great part in this. Thank you for your attention.